This is not a history of the whole of Lambeth, but an account of the place that Londoners looking across the river would have called Lambeth, the ancient settlements of Water Lambeth and Lambeth Marsh, the more recent suburbs of Waterloo, Vauxhall, Kennington and South Lambeth, and the modern area of the South Bank. There is a defining period of transition, roughly from 1750 to 1900, when Lambeth was recast from rural Surrey parish into major South London suburb. Between 1801 and 1901, its population rose from 28,000 to 302,000. This 11-fold increase was the driver for change. In that frenetic century, Lambeth's static population was flooded with migrant workers and refugees from the declining agricultural communities of southern England. Its riverbanks were laid out as wharves, and its ferries became road bridges. Marshes were drained, and green fields given over to streets of houses. Hamlets became new suburbs. Village centres became industrial areas. The old systems of local government, of charity and of public health could not cope, and were reinvented to manage this sheer volume of humanity. In the process, a number of different versions of Lambeth evolved. Once an area known for its market gardens, a century and a half later, it would be synonymous with its potteries and other industry. It became famous for its theatres and pleasure gardens, but was still visited for its prostitutes. Its status as new middle-class suburb at the beginning of the 19th century was almost immediately destroyed by railway building. Its streets of smaller terraced houses were bombed and redeveloped after the war, and it is a place that continues to reinvent itself. Church and Palace.
We builded Jerusalem as a city and a temple. From Lambeth we began our foundations. Lovely Lambeth.
William Blake, Jerusalem, 1804. The river defined and shaped the settlement of Lambeth. The Thames runs north from Vauxhall and then turns to flow east along King's Reach towards the city. In the crook of that river bend, raised on two low-lying islands or sandbanks between the marshes and the ancient course of the River Neckinger, were the twin settlements of Water Lambeth and Lambeth Marsh. These hamlets were the earliest areas of habitation, and critically, the location for the parish church. They occupied the areas now covered by the northern end of the Albert Embankment at Lambeth Bridge and by Lower Marsh. Old street names are a reminder of the precariousness of the location. Narrow Wall, now Belvedere Road, and Broad Wall, now Hatfields, protected the inhabitants of Upper Marsh and Lower Marsh from the river's periodic floods. Conservative estimates date the foundation of the Church of St Mary the Virgin in Water Lambeth at 1062. It appears in the Domesday Book as a landholding in its own right, the property of Edward the Confessor's sister, Goda. The stone tower of the later medieval church, erected in 1377 to replace an earlier wooden one, is the oldest visible building in Lambeth. The body of St Mary's was rebuilt in the early 16th century and then completely restored and rebuilt in 1852. The church was declared redundant in 1972, and extraordinary as it now seems, was marked for demolition and redevelopment until the newly founded Museum of Garden History rescued it in 1977. Across Lambeth Road and overshadowing St Mary's stands Lambeth Palace. Its association with the Archbishops of Canterbury dates from 1197, when Lambeth Manor was granted to the then Archbishop by the convent of St Andrew, Rochester. Archbishop Walter was keen to set up a secular, London-based household away from the monastic influence of the religious houses in Canterbury. By the end of the 13th century, Lambeth Palace was the accepted London residence for the Archbishop, with its Great Hall the regular setting for banquets and the consecration of new bishops. For many years, palace and parish church were the only significant buildings in Lambeth, certainly the only ones visible from across the Thames. The church's cultural and political power meant Lambeth Palace was the setting for events of national significance. Erasmus came in 1506 to present Archbishop Warham with his translation of Euripides. Sir Thomas More was a regular visitor, and it was here that he refused to take the oath recognising Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England, a denial that led to his execution. Archbishop Cranmer, the man responsible for More's death, suffered in his turn during the Marian persecutions. The Lambeth home where he composed the new prayer book for Edward VI became the Lambeth prison, where he was interned and interrogated prior to being burnt at the stake. When the forces of Parliament took control of London early in the Civil War, they constructed a defensive wall around the city. Forts at Vauxhall and on St George's Fields with earth ramparts between cut off the parishioners of Stockwell and Norwood from their parish church. The royalist vicar, Daniel Featley, was fired on by soldiers during Sunday service but escaped death. Lambeth Palace was commandeered, symbolically renamed Lambeth House, and used as a military prison. Tombs of the medieval archbishops were desecrated, and royalist prisoners were held in such overcrowded conditions that many died. One survivor was the Cavalier poet Richard Lovelace, and in his most famous lyric we find inspiration from his time in Lambeth House.
Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds innocent and quiet take that for a hermitage.
The palace has been unusual in retaining its original function for over 8 centuries. Archbishop Langton was resident there at the beginning of the 13th century, and the present incumbent still lives here at the beginning of the 21st century. It is still essentially a private residence. Morton's Tower, the Tudor brick entrance gateway named after the archbishop who commissioned it, is the only part of the palace readily seen today, and was the only point of contact for local people in the past. It was here that the Lambeth Dole, a charitable distribution of bread and meat, was made to the poor 3 times a week, and it was to this gate that the disaffected came in times of riot. In 1640, the London mob hammered on the doors and called for the unpopular Archbishop Laud, who was subsequently executed. In 1780, the mob was back, when the palace became a focus for the anti-Catholic Gordon rioters. Troops held back the angry crowds, while Archbishop Cornwallis and his family made a hasty retreat across the Thames in a small boat. Yet for all these urban intrusions, if the Archbishop stood in the palace garden, he might imagine himself yet in some rural community, with only the distant towers of Westminster Abbey to remind him of what was across the river. Lambeth Gardens. John Evelyn, commenting on Elias Ashmole's Lambeth House in 1678.
The prospect from the turret is very fine, it being so near London, and yet not discovering any house about the country.
While Gilbert White writes in 1778 of his brother's farm in Lambeth,
The green woodpecker laughs in the fields of Vauxhall.
Wenceslas Holler published a panorama of London and Westminster in 1670. The imaginary viewpoint is from just above St Mary at Lambeth's, now the Museum of Garden History's, church tower. But the foreground is initially puzzling. The bristling towers of the twin cities squat on the northern skyline, but what meets the eye are the hedges and small field plots of Lambeth Marsh, interspersed with the very occasional house. For all its proximity to London, Lambeth was still part of the rural hinterland surrounding London, a region of small farms and market gardens that supplied food for the metropolis. Lambeth's most famous gardening family were contemporaries of Holler. John Tradescant came to South Lambeth in 1628 to establish his 3 acres of garden ground and orchards, subsequently managed by his son, John the Younger. The elder John was a career gardener, working successively for the Earl of Salisbury at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, for the Duke of Buckingham's Essex estate, and managing the gardens of Oatlands Palace for King Charles before acquiring his Lambeth property. This was a time when a well-kept garden was an indicator of status and education, and when aristocratic hobbyists vied to be the first to introduce new exotics into their flower beds. John's patrons, and his own intense botanical curiosity, took him, and later his son, on collecting expeditions to France, Holland, Russia, and Virginia, and introduced many now familiar plants and trees, including Muscovy roses, stocks, spiderwort or Tradescantia, and the larch. But they did not just confine themselves to plants. The Tradescants' personal cabinet of curiosities, which had started as a collection of botanical specimens, quickly grew to include animal skins and bones, birds' eggs, seashells, and celebrity objects like Henry VIII's stirrups and Henry VII's gloves. It also included objects from distant cultures, like the deerskin cloak from a Virginia Indian chief, and drums and trumpets from Africa, which were equally fascinating to Londoners as exotic plants. It was often difficult to separate the mythical and the actual. So alongside zoological specimens like the dodo or the polar bear were fictions like feathers from the wings of a phoenix and the beak of a griffin. Their South Lambeth house and its collection, known as Tradescants Ark, became a sort of museum for the paying public. Here London's elite and European travellers came to view the marvels. One such visitor said in 1634 of his visit,
"I am almost persuaded a man might in one day behold and collect into one place more curiosities than he should see if he spent all his life in travel."
The Tradescants' neighbour Elias Ashmole, an antiquarian and astrologer, catalogued the collection in 1656. His subsequent obsessive interest in the rarities, after John Tradescant the Younger died, descended into deceit and chicanery, but saw the collection preserved as the world's first public museum, albeit one commemorating his own rather than the Tradescant name. The Ashmolean Museum opened in Oxford in 1683. After the Tradescants' death, their lands in South Lambeth reverted to farmland. At the end of the 18th century, the house was occupied by Thomas and Ben White, farming brothers to the more famous Gilbert, who visited frequently and described the agricultural routine of this typical Lambeth farm in his diary. Many other farmers and commercial gardeners flourished in Lambeth. As the Westminster Bridge Commissioners had noted in 1746, the soil of Lambeth was
a rich black mould, extremely good for gardens and extremely bad for a road.
There were market gardeners like John Gold and Simon Harding, who cultivated the Walcott estate in Kennington, nurserymen like John Malcolm, which supplied plants for the gardens of the new middle-class villas, and scientific botanists like William Curtis, who opened his famous London Botanic Garden behind Broadwall in 1779, with a printed prospectus and plant catalogue. Within 10 years he had 6,000 plants labelled according to the Linnaean system, of which he was the first serious English advocate, as well as a reputation as one of the country's first scientific botanists, through his publications Flora Londoniensis and Botanical Magazine. Yet within 10 years, Curtis was forced out to more rural premises on Fulham Road.
I had long observed with regret that I had an enemy to contend with in Lambeth Marsh, which neither time, nor ingenuity, nor industry could vanquish. And that was the smoke of London, which, except when the wind blew from the south, constantly enveloped my plants.
This was part of a larger, irresistible growth of London. When the Westminster Bridge Commissioners had sampled the local soil back in 1746, it was as a prelude to constructing the first new London Thames crossing in over 800 years. The new bridge and its attendant link roads opened in 1750, and suddenly the fields of Lambeth were a new development opportunity for builders. What really drove Curtis onto Fulham was the laying out of a new road, the New Cut, to the north of his gardens, that cut off the drainage ditches to the Thames and polluted the soil, while his landlord, sensing the opportunity, put up the rents for the ground. Development was a powerful economic force that it was almost impossible for individuals to stand against. By 1826, a Lambeth historian observed that
buildings, or what may more properly be termed the tumbling up of tumble-down houses, are so rapidly increasing that in a year or two there will be scarcely a green space for the resort of the inhabitants.
The year after William Curtis moved out, another Londoner moved in. William Blake and his wife Catherine came to Lambeth in the autumn of 1790, leaving the built-up streets of Westminster for the less developed south side of the river. They moved into a comparatively spacious 3-storey house, 13 Hercules buildings, in a newly built street that ran between Lambeth and Westminster Bridge Roads. Blake's trade as an engraver required light for his drawing and close work, and space to accommodate his rolling press that filled a whole room. The new Lambeth house offered affordable light and space. It also provided him for the first time with a garden, to which he brought a vine and a fig tree. Immediately before he moved to Lambeth, Blake had produced his first work to combine his gifts of poet, artist and engraver. The Songs of Innocence, published in 1788, was a home-grown production of verse and designs etched onto plates, printed out, hand-coloured with watercolour and bound to form a book. The companion volume, The Songs of Experience, was the first that Blake printed at Hercules Buildings in 1794. The poems from these two collections are some of Blake's most accessible and defined his reputation as a poet. In his lyric London, from the latter book, we get a sense of what Lambeth meant to the poet.
I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe.
Blake's London is actually Blake's Lambeth, the narrow riverside streets south of the church and Lambeth Palace, like Princes Street and Upper Fore Street, where new uses were being found for the old houses of Water Lambeth. Industry.
Lambeth was at that time a perfect congeries of evil odours. It presented a richer and more varied nosegay of stinks than any other part of the metropolis. This was due not merely to the open drains, but to the fact that the industries of bone boiling, bone crushing and manure concoction were specially carried out at Lambeth.
Henry Doulton on his youth in Lambeth in the 1830s. Lambeth's location defined its earliest trades. From the first settlement it had been known for its river fishing. One 11th century custom of Lambeth Manor required the tenant to pay an annual rental to the Bishop of Rochester of 1,000 lampreys, a delicacy to be found locally in the marshy waters. As late as 1750, when a violent earth tremor demolished buildings at Vauxhall,
the fishermen then at work on the river imagined a porpoise or some other large fish had risen under the boat.
Lambeth had a reputation for its boat builders, and for the riverside barge houses city companies used for storing their ceremonial barges. It was also a centre for Thames watermen, the all-purpose ferrymen who carried people and goods across and along the river. By the 17th century, the Lambeth foreshore, embanked and partially drained, was becoming an extension of London. Cheaper land and its positioning beyond the restrictive licensing powers of the city and its guilds encouraged new, malodorous or otherwise antisocial industries. The river was still the principal transport conduit, so all types of material were stored and processed here. There were timber yards, sugar bakers and flour mills, as well as more unusual or prestigious repositories.
With Mrs. Godolphin to Lambeth, to that rare magazine of marble to take order for chimney pieces, etc. The owner of the works had built him a pretty dwelling. This Dutchman had contracted with the Genoeses for all their marble, etc. We also saw the Duke of Buckingham's glasswork, where they had made huge vases of metal as clear and ponderous and thick as crystal, also looking-glasses, far larger and better than any that come from Venice.
From the Diary of John Evelyn, 19th of September, 1676. Gerard Waymans had built several marble cutting mills, as well as his own riverside house known as Marble Hall, at Vauxhall. The Duke of Buckingham's glass house was one of several Vauxhall glassworks breaking the Venetian monopoly on looking-glass manufacture. The critical technology, the discovery that coal-fired furnaces operated at a higher temperature than wood or charcoal, was also developed in Lambeth by Sir Edward Zouche. The site is commemorated in the present Glasshouse Street. Thomas Field, who made the candles lit to celebrate the birth of the Princess Elizabeth in 1533, had his workshop on Lambeth Marsh, and the firm of Fields continued to manufacture candles and soap on the same site in Upper Marsh until 1944. Price's Candles opened its factory at the foot of Vauxhall Bridge in 1830. Candle manufacture was one antisocial industry that moved south of the river. The process of preparing and rendering fat for tallow candles on an industrial scale was peculiarly foul-smelling. Another was vinegar manufacture. Distilleries that established themselves in the 18th century included Pratt & Morby's on the site of Copt Hall in Vauxhall, Beaufoy's Vinegar Works at Cuppers Gardens, displaced by Waterloo Bridge and relocated to South Lambeth Road, and Burnett's Distillery on Fore Street, subsequently the Albert Embankment. Code's Artificial Stoneworks was a later manufacturer of luxury goods. Eleanor Code set up her artificial moulded stone manufactory at Westminster Bridge in 1769. Frost and smoke resistant and able to retain its sharpness over time, the Code range of garden statuary and architectural ornament became a desirable addition to fashionable houses and gardens. The business remained in Lambeth until 1837. Code left a significant built legacy, including the Gothic screen in St George's Chapel at Windsor and the River God at Ham House. In Lambeth there is the stone lion from the former Lion Brewery, now on Westminster Bridge, the Lambeth Charity School boy statue here in the museum, and the tomb of John Seeley, Eleanor Code's business partner, in St Mary's Churchyard. Much of the smoke that polluted William Curtis's garden came from steam engines. The windmills that lined the Lambeth foreshore were displaced by steam-powered flour mills. The earliest was the short-lived Albion Mills at Blackfriars Bridge, burned down in 1792 by Luddite millers, alarmed by the threat it posed. Steam sawmills displaced the traditional hand sawyers and their sawpits. In 1819, Applegarth and Cowper opened the first steam-powered printing press at their works off Stamford Street. They were taken over by William Clowes and Son, who went on to become London's largest commercial printers. The engineering firm of Maudsley, Son and Field was established in Lambeth from 1810 on Westminster Bridge Road, with a riverside dock on Pedlar's Acre, where they built and successfully launched the first Thames-built steamship, the Lord William Bentinck, in 1832. They also built the new steam pumping engines for the Lambeth Waterworks Company in 1831. Not that technology did anything to improve this product.
"The quality is filthy, and the supply both scanty and irregular,"
noted one newspaper, presumably because the company still drew its supply from the polluted tidal river at Hungerford Bridge. There were other metalworking and engineering trades along the river. The most visually obvious were the two shot towers either side of Waterloo Bridge, producing lead shot and musket balls for the army. The circular brick-built tower belonging to Walker, Parkers and Company survived the war and was incorporated into the Festival of Britain site. Lambeth had long been an important centre for pottery. Again, the riverside location was attractive for the transport of bulk materials and finished goods. The earliest 17th century kilns were set up in the large houses that were being vacated as Lambeth started to change character. Norfolk House, the London residence of the Dukes of Norfolk across Lambeth Road from the Palace, and Copt Hall in Vauxhall, home to Sir Thomas Parry and the Marquis of Worcester, were both producing inexpensive tin plate Delftware and stoneware goods for the domestic market, including chamber pots, plates, bowls and drug jars. It was a 19th century potter who came to define and dominate the Lambeth industry. John Doulton began working at one of the Lambeth Walk potteries in 1812. He set up in partnership there, and through the 1820s the business of Doulton and Watts expanded into Lambeth High Street and eventually the length of the Albert Embankment, taking over other firms like Stiff's and Janeway's in the process. With economies of scale came technological innovation. Doulton's was the first pottery to link the steam engine and the potter's wheel. The firm developed new markets: acid-resistant stoneware for the chemical industry, decorative salt glazeware for middle-class mantelpieces, faience tile panels for interior decoration, like those in the children's wards of St Thomas's Hospital, terracotta decoration for the exterior of public buildings. Their showrooms on Lambeth High Street were a late Victorian confection of every available interior and exterior ceramic decoration. The Harrods Building on Knightsbridge and the Russell Hotel in Russell Square are examples of how this was translated into London's public architecture. A more personal memorial is Sir Henry Doulton's terracotta mausoleum in West Norwood Cemetery. But it was the stoneware drain pipe, a far more humble and largely invisible product, that was to make Doulton's name. Like all the fast-developing suburbs of London, Lambeth suffered from jerry-built housing with inadequate drainage. Cholera, which had visited Lambeth in 1832, returned in 1848. The connection between the epidemic and drainage or drinking water was not yet established, but the Lambeth Vestry commissioned a survey of sanitary conditions in the same year. The sewer running from Westminster Bridge Road was singled out, but was also typical.
A long drain almost uncovered to its whole extent, in the most filthy, abominable state imaginable, containing within it the discharge from water closets in a stagnant state, dead animals of various kinds, vegetable matter in a state of putrefaction and decomposition, emitting a stench and effluvia strong enough to contaminate the whole neighbourhood.
These visions of the greatest city in the world as a third-world slum acted as a wake-up call. The 1848 Public Health Act coincided with Doulton's unveiling of their new stoneware drainpipe, which quickly became both the national and international industry standard. One logical extension was to manufacture the fittings that went on the end of the drainpipes. By the 1860s, the company also had a reputation for its urinals, baths, water closets and wash basins. Lambeth was becoming one of the industrial centres of London. But zoning, as we now understand it, did not exist. All this commercial activity was taking place cheek by jowl with ordinary people's houses. A report in 1848 gave a glimpse of what this meant. At the 4 Street bone-crushing factories,
the smell complained of as a great nuisance. The bone bugs creep through the wall into the next house.
At the floorcloth manufactory on Kennington Lane,
the boiling of oil is complained of as detrimental to health.
On Stangate, it was the smell of the Sasol Asphalt Company. On Carlisle Lane, that of the soap maker and bone boiler, while the residents of Kennington Common complained of the twin delights of farmers' vitriol works making sulphuric acid and a catgut manufactory. More overpowering than all of these was the smoke and the choking acid pollution from the potteries. Doulton's basic product was salt-glazed stoneware, which fired salt to produce a hard, impermeable glaze. This simple, inexpensive process had an unfortunate chemical byproduct, chlorine gas, that polluted the air for all of Lambeth's inhabitants. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury noticed it was killing his trees. The potteries dominated the riverside from Westminster Bridge down to Vauxhall. They were speculative, unplanned, and unregulated. But unusually, they also presented themselves daily across the Thames to some of the most influential people in the land. The major redevelopment of the riverside frontage for the new Albert Embankment in the 1860s swept away the remnants of the old Water Lambeth village, created flood protection with a new river wall, and obliged existing firms to rebuild and relocate their premises. All, so the story goes, because MPs wanted to improve the view from the House of Commons. Doulton's certainly made some aesthetic concessions. The 71-metre-high factory chimney attached to their new studio, the tallest structure in Lambeth in 1876, was built to resemble an elegant Italian campanile, reputedly on the advice of John Ruskin. Lambeth ceased to be attractive to industry once the river was no longer the main transport route. Inadequate road links, London land values, and the increasing scale of manufacture drove many successful businesses out. Price's Candles needed room to expand and left Vauxhall for Battersea by the 1850s. Maudsley's success as boat builders took them downstream to deeper water at Woolwich. The Vauxhall Ironworks on Wandsworth Road developed an early internal combustion engine motor car, but had to move out to a greenfield site on the edge of Luton to exploit their product, and to become one of the major British car manufacturers. By the 20th century, Doultons were the largest single employer, but they too planned to relocate to their works at Burslem in Staffordshire. The war delayed this, but 4 centuries of pottery manufacture ceased in Lambeth in 1956. Kennington.
Through Kennington and all the tons which make us wish ourselves in town at once, through groves so called as being void of trees, like Lusus from no light, through prospects named Mount Pleasant, as containing naught to please, nor much to climb, through little boxes framed of bricks, to let the dust in at your ease, with "To be let" upon their doors proclaimed.
From Canto 11 of Lord Byron's Don Juan, 1823. Kennington lay beyond the river, remaining rural and substantially unchanged for a longer period, but transition from market gardens to extended London suburb was rapid when it finally arrived. Kennington Manor was acquired by the Crown in 1337, a royal association which remains today, with the Prince of Wales' continued ownership of residual parts of the manor as the Duchy of Cornwall estate. Edward III gifted the manor to his eldest son, the Black Prince, who built a palace on Kennington Lane. It was a place of power and influence. 2 of Edward III's parliaments met there. Richard II frequently stayed there, while his uncle, John of Gaunt, used it as a refuge from the London mob. Henry VII used it on the eve of his coronation, as it was close to his Archbishop's palace. Henry VIII demolished Kennington and reused the materials for his new palace at Whitehall. The manor remained the property of the Princes of Wales. The young Prince Charles lived in the new manor house on Kennington Lane before becoming king in 1625. Today, the only reminders of that royal influence are the Prince of Wales feathers motifs on the model buildings and mansion blocks built by the Duchy of Cornwall estate in 1916. For most Londoners, Kennington meant the wild expanse of common that the coach traveller was obliged to cross on the journey south from London Bridge. Kennington Park is the rump of that once extensive area. By 1700, it was losing its original function as grazing land for the cattle of the tenants of the manor. Carved up by roads and encroached on for housing, there was simply not enough grass left. Instead, it was notorious for its gallows. Public executions were held there from the 1640s. Crowds would flock to see a witch burnt, or rioters and highwaymen hung at the Triple Trees. When Jacobite rebels involved in the 45 Rebellion were executed there in 1746, the crowd witnessed the full theatre of a state execution for treason. The prisoners were dragged to the gallows on hurdles, hanged, drawn, quartered, beheaded and disembowelled, with their entrails burnt on a brazier for good measure. The final execution at Kennington was that of John Badger in 1799, hanged for forgery. Evangelical preachers used the same space for prayer meetings, often at the same time as a public hanging, to be sure of a good audience. Clerics like George Whitfield and Charles Wesley drew audiences of thousands. Wesley's journal for June 1739 records,
"I walked to Kennington Common, and cried to multitudes upon multitudes, Repent ye, and believe the gospel."
The incongruity of holding prayer meetings at a gallows did not trouble these preachers, and 50 years later it was not to trouble the Church of England's commissioners of new churches. Kennington required a local place of worship, and the recently vacated Gallows Common became the site for the parish church. St Mark's was consecrated in 1824, but not before workmen had unearthed one of the gibbet irons used for displaying the bodies of executed prisoners to 18th century rubberneckers travelling along the Coach Road. The Common remained a sufficiently large space for any number of different users. Regiments paraded here or assembled prior to suppressing disturbances like the Gordon riots. It was used for political meetings. The local poll by the electors of the Brixton 100 took place here for the election of the Surrey and subsequently Lambeth MPs. It also had a reputation as an unofficial speaker's corner where the disaffected could meet. The most famous instance was the Chartist meeting of April 1848. Their intention was to march to Parliament with a national petition demanding various reforms, including the vote for all. In response, 20,000 troops and 150,000 special constables were assembled to guard London. Cavalry regiments patrolled out of sight around the Common. 500 police were concealed in stables on Kennington Road. Field artillery was trained on Westminster Bridge. The elderly Duke of Wellington, then Home Secretary, was spotted at dawn, riding down Fentiman Road to deploy his troops. The rector of St Mark's, afraid of looters, buried the church plate in the garden of the parish school. But in the end, it came to nothing. The Chartist leaders, under pressure from the police, agreed to not hold the march. The petition was sent to Westminster by coach. The crowd dispersed, and revolution, or a peculiarly English version of it, was averted. One result was the transformation of Kennington Common into a park, the first in Lambeth. Unlike later parks, the motive was not the preservation of open space, but rather the desire to ensure that such meetings should never recur. Kennington Park opened in 1853, encircled by iron railings and lockable gates, with bylaws forbidding political and religious meetings, gambling, soliciting, and all the other off-limits activities that the Common had previously hosted. Ornamental flower beds, a bandstand, and serpentine walks among groves of newly planted plane trees provided a controlled space. Cricket had been played regularly on the Common, but was now banned. Prince Albert himself is said to have brought pressure on the Duchy of Cornwall estate to find an alternative venue, and the Oval, an area of market gardens, became a replacement cricket ground. Kennington changed dramatically after the construction of Westminster Bridge. A link road was built to connect it to the coach routes from the south. Two of these, the old road from Streatham and Croydon, and the new road from Tooting and Clapham, Brixton and Clapham roads, met at Kennington Common before heading towards London Bridge. It was here that the link road, Kennington Road, met the old coach road, Kennington Park Road, at the Horns Tavern. This old coaching inn was rebuilt in the 19th century, and the redundant stabling was replaced by an assembly room for concerts, meetings and public lectures. The Horns was bombed in the war, and its prominent corner site is now occupied by offices. In 1818, more roads were needed to connect Vauxhall Bridge with Camberwell, Harleyford Road and Camberwell New Road. The opportunities presented to landowners and developers were irresistible. Ribbon developments of newly built, grandly named and architecturally unremarkable flat-fronted terraces and villas soon lined these new roads, gently satirised by Byron in Don Juan as the epitome of suburban London. In 1850, the construction of the new Lambeth Vestry Hall on Kennington Road marked the extent to which the area had changed. Local government was growing. The previously limited parish functions, care of the poor, maintenance of highways and management of parochial charities, were dwarfed by new responsibilities for street lighting, rubbish collection, sewers and drainage, public health and building control. The former vestry rooms by St Mary's Church were inadequate. A new and appropriately grand building needed to be located at the hub of Lambeth. By 1850, the suburban process meant that Kennington was this hub. 50 years later, the further growth of Lambeth would mean a still larger and more imposing town hall would be built in Brixton. But number 367 Kennington Road, now used as offices, with its classical revival architecture and imposing pillared entrance, still recalls that moment of municipal glory. The Railway Age.
Our train went out of what lately was Hungerford Market, over what was Hungerford Bridge. Instead of the graceful curves of that, we now have a horizontal line of huge gratings, between the bars of which the folks on the footway stood to gaze at us. All the rest of the way, our Asmodeus machine looks over the roofs of poor men's houses which it has made horrible to live in, and passes across the sites of infinite dwellings destroyed.
Arthur J. Munby, on the first train out of Charing Cross, 11th of January, 1864. The advent of railway building in London from the 1830s was to have a dramatic effect on the local landscape, nowhere more devastatingly so than in Lambeth. The first London line from Greenwich to London Bridge opened in 1836, quickly followed by the London and South Western Railways line from London to Southampton. The section from Woking opened in 1838, when the line terminated on the edge of Lambeth at Nine Elms. The arrangement suited Queen Victoria, as it was handy for Buckingham Palace. A private suite of rooms was maintained at the station until 1902 for visiting dignitaries. But for most passengers, forced to continue their journey by boat from Windmill Pier or by omnibus along the Wandsworth Road, Nine Elms was an inconvenient London terminus. The difficulty was the cost of constructing the line through densely populated Vauxhall and Lambeth Marsh. In 1845, approval was obtained, and the 3.2-kilometre line through to Waterloo was built on a viaduct over 290 arches and 6 bridges. The destruction of the centre of Lambeth was seen as of little consequence in comparison with the benefit to passengers and LSWR shareholders. According to the Illustrated London News in 1848, nothing of value had been destroyed, as the course of the line had been occupied
To a great extent by hay stalls and cow yards and dung heaps and similar nuisances.
In fact, the line snaked its way along the routes of least resistance, carefully avoiding the vested interests of Vauxhall Gardens and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The latter did not want the line encroaching on his palace grounds. More was lost in successive expansions of the line. Maudsley's engineering works, the Royal Swimming Baths, All Saints' Church, and a myriad of smaller streets and courts were demolished. The Beaufoy Institute was carved up. The Canterbury Music Hall had its theatre separated from its entrance by the railway line. Patrons walked through a long arch to reach the auditorium, enlivened by an aquarium en route. The first stop down the line was the new station at Vauxhall, which provides a curious footnote to railway history. The Russian word for railway station is Vauxhall, and 2 potential explanations can be suggested. The first being that the Tsar visited Queen Victoria by train and was met at Nine Elms, then known as the Queen's private station at Vauxhall, and assumed that this was the generic term for a railway station. The other concerns the very first Russian railway line that ran from St. Petersburg to the Tsar's summer residence at Pavlovsk in 1837. To attract St. Petersburg society, concerts were held in a semicircular building next to the station. The architect knew Vauxhall Gardens and called his building Vauxhall à l'Anglaise. The station and the concert hall soon became synonymous as Vauxhall, or the Pavlovsk Music Station. In 1864, the South Eastern Railway extended its London terminus from London Bridge across the river to a new station at Charing Cross. The line ran through the north of Lambeth and made use of a rebuilt Hungerford Bridge. A pedestrian bridge had opened in 1849. On the south side of the Thames, the SER built a new station to link with the LSWR terminus, Waterloo Junction Station, now known as Waterloo East. It was this line that drove St Thomas's Hospital, an ancient religious foundation, from the borough into Lambeth. The governors sold up the site to the SER and relocated on a narrow strip of frontage between the LSWR railway line and the river, on the newly built Albert Embankment. A more unusual addition to the rail network was the Necropolis Railway Company that started operating from Waterloo. The company was trading directly on the effect of the 1852 Metropolitan Burials Act that had closed all London churchyards and required burials to take place in out-of-town cemeteries. The local options were burial in the new parochial Lambeth Cemetery in Tooting, the slightly more upmarket service provided by the private South Metropolitan Cemetery Company at its cemetery in Norwood, or a one-way ticket on the Necropolis Railway. The company provided a discreet funeral service from its private platforms, one for mourners, one for coffins, to its cemetery at Brookwood. When Waterloo opened, it had a modest 4 lines of track and 4 platforms. It expanded through the 19th century as demand grew, until it was the largest London railway terminus by 1885, with 21 platforms, approached along a viaduct of 8 lines of track. This piecemeal expansion resulted in 3 separate stations, known as Waterloo Bridge, Cyprus and Khartoum, the names commemorating colonial exploits in the years of their construction, and a reputation by the end of the century as a chaotic terminus, the butt of much music hall humour, best enshrined in Jerome K. Jerome's 3 Men in a Boat, where the heroes struggle to find the Kingston train and bribe the driver of another engine to take them there. The present station was built in 1922, when all the platforms came under one roof. The most recent addition has been the construction of the Eurostar terminal on the north side of the station in 1990 to receive direct trains from Brussels and Paris. Occupying over 10 hectares of prime land in Lambeth, Waterloo remains the largest station in London, and arguably the most disruptive in the way it has dominated and destroyed the area and separated the old centre of Lambeth Marsh from the river. Theatre.
The lower orders rush there in mobs and in shirt-sleeves, applaud frantically, drink ginger beer, munch apples, crack nuts, call the actors by their Christian names, and throw them orange peel and apples by way of bouquet.
Charles Matthews, on the audience at the Victoria Theatre in the 1840s. Lambeth was known as a metropolitan place of entertainment from the 1660s, when the Riverside Pleasure Gardens at Vauxhall opened. First called New Spring Gardens and subsequently known as Vauxhall Gardens, their location right on the river provided an easily accessible venue by boat for Londoners who came to walk in the grounds, eat, drink, dance and listen to the orchestra. For other Londoners, like Samuel Pepys, Lambeth's riverside pubs were a convenient setting for extramarital encounters, safely distant from prying eyes.
In the afternoon, telling my wife that I go to Deptford, I went by water to Westminster Hall, and there, finding Mrs. Lane, took her over to Lambeth, where we were lately, and there did what I would with her, but for the main thing, which she would not consent to, for which God be praised.
Vauxhall's popularity increased in the late 18th century. On gala nights, the approach roads would suffer the Regency equivalent of gridlock, with coaches jammed all the way from Westminster Bridge. It was a peculiarly democratic destination, catering easily and simultaneously for the Prince Regent, members of the aristocracy, leading politicians, and literary figures like Goldsmith and Dr. Johnson, as much as for ordinary Londoners. In the 19th century, it devised more exotic entertainments, firework displays, balloon ascents, military pageants, tightrope walkers, and performing troops of Arabs, to titillate the fickle crowds. A succession of smaller pleasure gardens set up in Lambeth on the back of Vauxhall's success. Cupper's Gardens, the Apollo Gardens, the Dog and Duck, the Belvedere, and the Royal Cumberland Tea Gardens quickly rivalled Vauxhall's reputation as venues for casual prostitution, but were less successful in resisting the magistrate's attempts to shut them down as disorderly houses. By the beginning of the 19th century, Lambeth was an entertainment centre. The Surrey side, or transpontine London, had well-known venues catering for metropolitan and local audiences. Astley's Amphitheatre on Westminster Bridge Road and the Surrey Theatre on Blackfriars Road both opened as circuses, but by the 1820s had reinvented themselves as theatres. The Royal Coburg Theatre, subsequently the Victoria Theatre and latterly the Old Vic, opened in 1816. The smaller, cheaper Bower Theatre on Stangate in 1838, describing itself as the only theatre for the working classes. Astley's amphitheatre began in 1770 as a riding school and circus. It never lost these roots and maintained a reputation for its hippodramas, plays performed on horseback. These included British military victories. Agincourt and Waterloo were regularly staged. Low comedy and circus, like the clown on horseback who blew a candle out, not with his mouth. And equestrian versions of well-known plays like Othello, which were often mere vehicles for displays of trick riding in costume. As Andrew Ducrow, the theatre manager in the 1830s, put it,
"Cut out the dialect and come to the horses!"
The Surrey Theatre began as a circus rival to Astley's in 1784. By the 1820s, under the management of Charles Dibdin, it was a successful minor theatre. Famous melodramas like Black-Eyed Susan were premiered before transferring to the West End. Ira Aldridge, Britain's first successful black actor, appeared here in the 1840s, having first performed in Lambeth at the Royal Coburg in 1826. As did Henry William Lane, the Afro-American dancer known as Master Juba. In 1816, the tenants of the Surrey Theatre refused to pay a massive rent increase. Instead, they built a rival theatre. The patronage of Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the husband of Princess Charlotte, secured the necessary theatre licence from the magistrates and provided the theatre's name, the Royal Coburg. 2 years were spent building, as the swampy ground required huge quantities of stone footings. The Waterloo Bridge Company came in as a partner, confident that the increase in toll traffic on its bridge would justify the investment. However, West End theatregoers were nervous about venturing south, as the Times commented on the Royal Coburg's opening night.
They should also take care that the road from their bridge be well lighted, and still more that the footpath, for part of the way, be better fenced against the accidents of persons in the dark falling into the marshes.
Foot patrols were provided along the new Waterloo Road to reassure the hoped-for clientele. Lambeth theatres were restricted in what they could perform. Before 1843, it was illegal for minor theatres to present legitimate drama, defined generally as comedy, tragedy and farce. These remained the preserve of the West End patent theatres in Drury Lane and Covent Garden. When in 1820 the Royal Coburg invited the West End actor Junius Brutus Booth to perform Shakespeare's Richard III, the Theatre Royal Drury Lane took the Coburg to court, and the manager was fined £50. To avoid such a situation, a ballet might be inserted into a play, or the plot rewritten, or only a couple of scenes be performed. The Coburg staged new, rewritten dramas, The Lovers of Verona, The Battle of Bosworth Field, and The Moor of Venice, as a way of performing Shakespeare. What started as a ruse ended up by creating the amalgam of styles that was South London theatre, combining genre like circus, pantomime, melodrama, song, pageant and acrobatics. London critics were disparaging. One, describing a Surrey performance, commented,
"A minor theatre is the proper region of melodrama, an entertainment to which we have no objection, providing it be found in its right place."
The audiences seemed uncultivated and threatening. The drama was doubtful in quality and frequently inaudible. But most offensive was the undeniable link with prostitution. The streets and public houses adjacent teemed with prostitutes. In 1865, the Magdalen home had to leave Blackfriars Road and relocate to Streatham, unable to cope with the anomaly of reforming prostitutes next door to the Surrey Theatre, where their less penitent sisters conducted business. The Victoria Theatre, as the Royal Coburg was now known, was notorious. Charles Kingsley described it as
"the licensed pit of darkness, trap of temptation, profligacy and ruin triumphantly yawning night after night."
In 1884, a group of social reformers led by Emma Cons and Samuel Morley MP acquired it. They had links with the temperance movement and with the National Vigilance Association. The theatre reopened as the Royal Victoria Hall and Coffee House, where the proceedings now consisted of
music, fun and temperance addresses. The great object of these attractive entertainments is to win people from the public house.
This educational work was transferred to the new Morley College, subsequently on Westminster Bridge Road. The Victoria Hall, under the management of Con's niece Lillian Bayliss, reopened as the Old Vic in 1916, when it became a theatre dedicated to the serious staging of Shakespeare. The heyday of Lambeth Theatres was brief. Vauxhall Gardens had closed by 1859, the Bower was converted to a candle warehouse in 1877, in 1893 Astley's was closed down under fire regulations. From the 1860s, local audiences increasingly favoured music halls like the Canterbury, Gatties and the Metropole. The Surrey underwent a slow decline, through music hall and cinema to final closure in the 1930s. The Old Vic is the sole survivor today of that once grand theatre tradition. Visions of Hell.
I am at present living in Lambeth, doing my best to get at the meaning of that strange world, so remote from our civilization.
George Gissing, in a letter to his sister, 1886. William Wordsworth's 1802 Upon Westminster Bridge opens, "Earth has not anything to show more fair." One instinctively knows he was looking north at the time. James Rennie's New Strand Bridge opened in 1817 on the second anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, and was described as one of the noblest bridges in Europe. Yet the suburbs of these bridges' southern approaches were neither noble nor fair. Lambeth had never been much admired as a riverside village. As a developing London suburb, it was to become a particularly unlovely place. One of the effects of the bridges was that Lambeth now provided an inexpensive central location. There was a concentration of London charities relocating to the southern end of the new bridges, which enabled the care of charges out of the sight of their patrons in London and Westminster. All the ills of urban society were to be found here. The Westminster Asylum, on Westminster Bridge Road, trained orphaned girls in household management for apprenticeship to middle-class families as servants. Its uniformed girls processed every Sunday to Lambeth Church, and sat in special pews, isolated from the congregation. The Lying-in Hospital on the same road provided for married and unmarried mothers from across London, once Lambeth's church wardens had examined their circumstances and ensured they would not be a burden on the parish poor rates. On Blackfriars Road, the Magdalen Home used a strict religious routine to reform prostitutes and train them for domestic service. It issued tickets to the public for Sunday services in its chapel, where respectable families could regard the fallen women, newly penitent in grey charity dresses and caps. The Bedlam Hospital at the end of Lambeth Road provided similar opportunities. Outings to look at the lunatics in their cells were popular. Visitors with different preoccupations still come to stare. The building now serves as the Imperial War Museum. In this environment, the new homes for the middle classes did not endure. Lewis Cottingham, who designed most of the houses for the Waterloo Bridge estate, was unusual in actually living in one of them with his library and antiquarian collections, but he was an exception. The Regency terraces laid out along Westminster Bridge Road, Lambeth Road and Kennington Road, and the ribbon development of villas southwards along the Brixton, Clapham and Camberwell New Roads never quite became the elegant suburbs their developers hoped for. Behind the main wide roads, the side streets were small and cheaply built. Middle-class occupiers didn't want to live next door to a railway goods yard, a candle factory or an asylum, and they migrated south along the newly laid tram lines and suburban railways through Brixton and Tulse Hill, Streatham and Norwood, and into the Surrey Hills. Flora Tristan, a French tourist, ventured south of the river past Lewis Cottingham's house in 1840, and she was horrified by what she saw.
This neighborhood is almost entirely inhabited by prostitutes and people who live off prostitution. It is courting disaster to go there alone at night. It was an hot summer evening. In every window and doorway women were laughing and joking with their protectors. Half-dressed, some of them naked to the waist. Oh, they were a revolting sight.
In the public imagination, Waterloo was turning into a Sodom of London to rival Whitechapel and St Giles. In 1844, Thomas Hood wrote The Bridge of Sighs, a sentimental account of the suicide by drowning of a young prostitute who jumped from Waterloo Bridge.
One more unfortunate, weary of breath, rashly importunate, gone to her death.
The epithet stuck. The Bridge of Sighs was visited regularly by London journalists, including Charles Dickens, to witness the miserable procession of women who trailed across the bridge of an evening from the cheap dormitory suburbs of Waterloo and Blackfriars to tout themselves in the theatres and gin palaces of the West End, returning across the river with the dawn. By the end of the century, the area was known as Misery Junction, notorious for organised gangs running Jewish prostitutes from Poland and theatrical and music hall agencies run out of hotels in Stamford Street. There was even a serial killer to rival Jack the Ripper. Thomas Cream, an unhinged medical doctor, poisoned 4 Lambeth prostitutes with strychnine in 1891 and 1892. He was convicted and hanged on the evidence of a 5th woman he failed to kill. Lambeth was becoming the setting for writers who, in the words of George Gissing,
"We'll oftener find inspiration in a London garret than amid the banality of the plutocrat's drawing-room."
And it was in one particular street, Lambeth Walk, that a number of late Victorian writers found their perfect fictional locus. Once a rural lane known as 3 Coney Walk, running south from Lambeth Road to some wells, it was subsequently laid out as a street of unremarkable houses. Perhaps because of its central location, or its name, or its street market, it acquired a reputation as the heart of the working-class community of Lambeth. George Gissing's Thyrza, published in 1886, was very precisely located around Lambeth Walk. Here the doomed romance between the educated Egremont, with his vision of improving the working classes by lecture programmes and a free library, and Thyrza, the beautiful local girl, is played out against a backdrop of mindless toil in factories. Lambeth represented something deeply personal and threatening for Gissing, for it was the place where his estranged, alcoholic wife was dying in poverty, in a room off Westminster Bridge Road, funding her addiction with casual prostitution. Another Lambeth writer, Clarence Rooke, produced Hooligan Nights in 1899, an early example of oral testimony, where Alf, a teenage professional criminal from Irish Court off Lambeth Walk, recounts his exploits to Rooke in various barrooms. Devoid of any moral comment, Alf's unscrupulous tales of burglaries in Clapham and Brixton, passing forged coin and street fighting, read as a curiously modern narrative. Also published in 1899, Liza of Lambeth was a story of infidelity, wife-beating, social drinking and illegitimacy, translated from the original South London vernacular by a young St Thomas's medical student named Somerset Maugham. Liza's heirs were the cheerful Cockney chappies of the next century's stage and screen, the sanitised South London of Me and My Girl, and a host of musical acts, like Alec Hurley, the Costa comedian, and Lupino Lane doing the Lambeth Walk, Pearly Kings and Queens, A Passport to Pimlico, Dick Van Dyke's Chimney Sweep, and endless news photos of smiling Londoners standing outside their bombed-out houses to greet the Queen Mum. Inventing the South Bank.
An opportunity to lighten a dull place, sweeten a sour spot, and for the first time bring the south of London into a dignified and beautiful frontage on the River Thames.
This was the 1905 verdict of Labour politician John Byrne on the proposal to build the new seat of London government, County Hall, on the Thames above Westminster Bridge. The decision was a novel one, and marked the first real attempt to involve Lambeth as a part of London. What had previously been a convenient repository for unacceptable industry, the city's social and charitable casualties, and a development zone for speculators and jerry-builders, was to belatedly acquire some municipal and architectural gravitas. The London County Council made its decision in 1905. The acquisition of the river frontage was contested by Lambeth Council. Their ownership of an ancient charitable estate, Pedlar's Acre, transformed from near-worthless marsh and osier beds to valuable commercial river frontage, was too lucrative to give up lightly. Construction of County Hall began in 1909, but was interrupted by the Great War. Its grandiose buildings of Portland stone, in a free classic style, finally opened in 1922, and would serve for 73 years as the bureaucratic hub of London government. By the end of World War II, the area of the South Bank to the north of County Hall evoked an older, damaged London. In a triangle of land edged by Waterloo and Westminster bridges and bisected by the railway, a bomb-damaged brewery and some burnt-out wharves were surmounted by that relic of a former industrial age, the Waterloo Shot Tower, used as the set for Jules Dassin's 1950 Night and the City. But something more worthy was planned. The Festival of Britain was to be much more than the redevelopment of a bomb site. Enough of Lambeth had been laid waste to the south to provide for comprehensive redevelopment of public housing that would transform the elevations and street plans of much of the borough over the next 25 years. Instead, as the Festival of Britain site guide explains, this area was to embody
a united act of national reassessment and one corporate reaffirmation of faith in the nation's future.
The Festival of Britain took as its model the Great Exhibition of 1851, the Victorian showcase of the industrial and colonial might of Great Britain. 100 years later, this new celebration carefully omitted the word great and eschewed anything Victorian. It focused instead on the modernist, brutalist architecture of Lasden's Royal Festival Hall and the jeu d'esprit of the Skylon, the Dome of Discovery and the Shot Tower, fitted out with radar in the roof. What had not changed was the frontage John Byrne had spoken of. The London that the festival site aspired to be part of and looked across to was on the north side of the river. The back of the site was sealed off from the rest of Lambeth. Along York Road and Waterloo Roads, canvas and tubular steel screens concealed the surviving, tawdry Regency buildings of Waterloo from view. And there is still a sense today, when approaching the much enlarged South Bank with its theatres, concert halls and gallery spaces from inland, of arriving at some unfinished premises by the back door. Riverside Lambeth has moved on, and its relationship with the Thames has changed. Lampreys no longer abound in the waters of the Thames, nor for that matter do barges. From its industrial age, it has moved through an office age, with new flagship buildings vying for prime riverside locations. The London Fire Authority, MI6, Thames Television and the Royal Pharmaceutical Society have all been here. But these are being supplanted in turn by the economics of a new residential age that places a premium on riverside views. Former office buildings undergo conversion to flats. The Shell Tower, when opened in Waterloo in 1962, was the largest and highest stone-faced commercial building in Britain. Now, like the Oxo Tower, its owners have realised the value of their Thameside real estate as residential space. Former industrial sites, like that at Vauxhall Bridgefoot, host variously to Price's Candles, the South Metropolitan Gas Works and the London Cold Store, are rebuilt as prestige apartments, while County Hall, stripped of its government function, is reinvented as a tourist hotel and an entertainment space, with aquaria, private galleries and bungee jumpers jostling for the passing trade. The aristocracy left Lambeth in the 17th century. Their houses became pottery kilns and sites for public parks. The 19th century middle-class suburban project, founded on railway building and antisocial industry. Now, in the 21st century, selected enclaves of Lambeth are populated by professional classes. The gentrified streets of Fentimore Road and Walcott Square provide pied-à-terre for MPs and professionals, while the river frontage between the Thames and the railway line blossoms with executive apartments and high culture.